What if collapse doesn't come with explosions? What if the most dangerous moment in an empire's life is not when enemies gather at the border, but when help arrives? History teaches us to fear invasion, to watch for armies and smoke on the horizon. But that lesson is incomplete, because some empires don't fall in flames. They fade while the lights stay on. The Ottoman Empire did not disappear in a single, dramatic instant. There was no final charge through its capital, no victorious army tearing down its symbols of power. Instead, the empire remained standing even as control slipped through its fingers. The palaces were still occupied, the throne was still warm, the flag still flew, yet the decisions that mattered were no longer being made there. This is the unsettling paradox at the heart of the story. An empire can survive in form while losing its substance. Power doesn't always vanish, it migrates. It moves quietly, hidden inside agreements, interest rates, and repayment schedules. And once that shift happens, no declaration is needed, no conquest must be announced. The Ottomans were not defeated by a superior army in their final act. They were defeated by a system that turned survival into dependence and assistance into ownership. What ended them was not the sound of cannon fire, but the scratch of a pen. Not an invasion, but a balance sheet. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, the empire was already living on borrowed time, quite literally. In the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire still looked impossible to kill. On a map, it was enormous. Its borders stretched across continents, binding Europe, Asia, and Africa into a single political body. From the Balkans to Anatolia, from the holy cities of Mecca and Medina down through North Africa, from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The empire appeared intact, continuous, and commanding. Millions lived under its rule. In Istanbul, the Sultan sat at the geographic and symbolic crossroads of the world, presiding over a realm that had shaped history for centuries. To outsiders, this scale was hypnotic. Size was mistaken for strength, longevity was confused with resilience. The empire still looked like a titan simply because it had always been one. But power does not decay symmetrically. It hollows out long before it collapses. And by the time the surface cracks, the core is already gone. Beneath the imperial imagery, the Ottoman economy was dangerously out of step with the world around it. While Britain and France were being remade by the Industrial Revolution, factories roaring, steam engines driving production, railways compressing distance, the Ottoman system remained overwhelmingly agrarian. It relied on manual labor, small-scale craft production, and peasant agriculture. Wooden plows scraped soil that was now competing against machines powered by coal and steel. The empire was playing a medieval game in a modern arena. This mismatch bled directly into the state's finances. The tax system was old, inefficient, and deeply corrupt. Revenue collection depended on layers of local officials who skimmed their share before anything reached the capital. By the time taxes arrived in Istanbul, they were already diminished. The treasury was chronically empty, not because the empire lacked people or land, but because it lacked control and efficiency. For generations, this weakness had been concealed with stopgap measures inherited from an earlier age. Currency was debased. Wealthy officials were stripped of their fortunes when cash ran short. These methods bought time, but they did not create growth. They were emergency responses in a world that had begun to demand structure, scale, and capital. The modern economy had no patience for improvisation. Armies now required industrial supply chains. Infrastructure demanded long-term investment. Survival itself had become expensive. The empire didn't just want money, it needed it, urgently and continuously. And for the first time in its long history, the Ottomans looked beyond their own system for that lifeline. They turned their gaze westward, toward the financial centers of Europe, unaware that what they were about to import was not simply capital, but dependency. For centuries, Ottoman rulers had treated foreign borrowing as a line that could not be crossed. There were moral reasons for this restraint, or deep religious discomfort with usury, but there were also strategic ones. Debt meant dependence, and dependence meant vulnerability. To borrow from the Christian powers of Europe was to invite influence, pressure, and eventually control. As long as the empire could avoid that path, it did. But restraint only survives until reality removes alternatives. In 1853, that moment arrived. The Russian Empire pushed into Ottoman territory, igniting what would become the Crimean War. This was not a limited border conflict. It was a modern, industrial-scale war, fought with mass armies, heavy artillery, and fleets that consumed resources at a terrifying rate. The Ottomans were no longer fighting with the tools of earlier centuries, and they did not have the money required to fight this kind of war alone. Britain and France stepped in, alarmed by Russian expansion and eager to preserve the balance of power. Their intervention looked like salvation. Troops arrived, warships filled the Black Sea, but behind the visible show of alliance came something quieter and far more consequential. Alongside the soldiers came bankers. The war bled the Ottoman treasury dry. Millions of gold liras vanished to pay wages, cast cannons, provision ships, and keep armies in the field. Every week of fighting deepened the deficit. The state was burning money it did not possess, and victory depended on spending even more. Sultan Abdul I stood at the center of the crisis, trapped between collapse and compromise. The options before him were all disastrous. Refuse funding, and the army would disintegrate. Accept funding, and the empire would cross a boundary it had resisted for generations. There was no clean solution, only delay or surrender. In 1854, the taboo was broken. The Ottoman Empire signed its first foreign loan, negotiated through British and French bankers. On paper, it was presented as cooperation between allies, a temporary financial bridge to ensure survival during wartime. The language was careful, reassuring, almost friendly. This was not conquest, they said. This was a partnership. But loans do not carry the intentions written around them. They carry obligations. What looked like assistance was, in reality, a structural transformation. The empire had not merely borrowed money, it had accepted a new logic of survival, one that replaced internal limits with external dependency. This agreement did not announce itself as a turning point. It didn't feel like defeat. Yet, it marked the moment when the dam cracked, when pressure that had been building for decades finally forced its way through. The war would end. The soldiers would go home, but the debt would remain. And with it, the quiet machinery that would begin to reshape the empire from the inside out. The damage was not hidden in the size of the loan. It was hidden in its design. On the surface, the numbers looked straightforward, but inside the fine print was a mechanism that ensured the empire would start losing the moment it signed. The issue price was 80. That single number changed everything. For every 100 units of debt the Ottoman government agreed to repay, it received only £80 in actual cash. The remaining £20 never reached Istanbul. It was absorbed immediately by the bankers as commission and so-called risk premium. From the first day, the empire was underwater, owing more than it had been given. Worse still, interest was calculated not on the £80 received, but on the full 100 owed in practice. This meant the Ottomans were paying high interest on money that had never existed in their treasury. It was debt with a missing foundation, a structure built on air. This imbalance was the original sin of Ottoman finance, and everything that followed would grow from it. At first, the consequences were easy to ignore. The cash that did arrive felt like a rescue. Soldiers were paid, supplies were restored, the immediate crisis faded. When the war ended in 1856 with Russian defeat, the decision seemed justified. Borrowing had worked, or at least it appeared to, and that illusion was the most dangerous outcome of all. The Sultan had discovered something intoxicating. With a signature placed on a document in London or Paris, gold could be summoned across continents. No tax reform, no painful restructuring, just ink on paper, and ships arrived heavy with money, for a state under constant pressure. This felt like power reclaimed, but this was not power. It was leverage moving in the opposite direction. When the cannons fell silent and the diplomats declared peace, the borrowing did not stop. The habit had formed. What began as an emergency measure was quietly reclassified as a tool of governance. Instead of confronting the empire's structural weaknesses, debt became the shortcut around them. Each new loan carried the same logic, the same imbalance, the same silent transfer of advantage. The money entered Istanbul briefly, then flowed outward again, pulled by interests that never slept. What the empire mistook for flexibility was, in reality, a tightening constraint. The war had ended, but a different kind of conflict had begun, one fought not on battlefields, but inside balance sheets. And unlike wars, this one had no armistice, no clear endpoint, only payments that came due again and again, each one reinforcing the grip of the trap. Easy credit didn't just fund projects, it changed behavior. It rewired how power thought, how decisions were made, how the future was imagined. Once borrowing became possible, restraint began to look unnecessary. Why reform when money could be summoned, Why wait when prestige could be purchased immediately? The Ottoman elite looked west and felt a quiet humiliation. Paris glowed under gaslight, London rose in marble and iron. These cities looked modern, confident, unstoppable. Istanbul, by comparison, felt ancient. And instead of asking how those societies had built their strength, the ruling class focused on how they looked when they were already rich. So the money didn't go into factories. It didn't build schools. It didn't modernize agriculture. It went into appearances. The purest expression of this impulse rose on the shores of the Bosphorus Dolmabahce Palace. Sultan Abdulaziz turned his back on Topkapi, the seat of Ottoman power for 4 centuries. It felt outdated, too rooted in the past, too Eastern. He wanted something that could stand beside Versailles and announce, visually, that the empire still belonged among the great powers. The result was breathtaking and catastrophic. 14 tons of gold leaf coated its surfaces. Italian marble lined its halls. Silk carpet softened every step. A staircase of baccarat crystal gleamed under the world's largest crystal chandelier, a gift from Queen Victoria herself. It was not just a palace, it was a declaration. And it cost 5 million Ottoman gold liras, roughly 1/4 of the empire's entire annual tax revenue. Every coin was borrowed. To sustain this vision, the empire returned to the bankers again and again. New loans were signed in 1855, then 1858, then 1860. Each one arrived with the same hidden imbalance, the same structural weakness, the same future obligation disguised as present relief. By the 1860s, the system had crossed a threshold. The empire was no longer borrowing to grow. It was borrowing to survive. New loans existed to pay interest on old ones. Nothing new was being created, only time was being purchased. This was no longer finance. It was a Ponzi scheme wearing imperial robes. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1860, debt payments consumed around 15% of state income. By 1870, that figure had climbed past 50%. More than half of every tax coin collected from a fisherman in Greece to a farmer in Syria vanished abroad the moment it was gathered. There was nothing left. No money for schools, no money for infrastructure, no money for defense. The empire still stood. Its ceremonies continued, its palaces gleamed, but inside, the state was hollowing out, slowly and irreversibly. Consumed not by enemies at the gates, but by obligations it could no longer escape. As the space between major foreign loans grew tighter, the Ottoman government began reaching for emergency cash wherever it could be found. When the treasury ran dry before the next European agreement could be arranged, officials crossed the Golden Horn into the Galata district of Istanbul. There, they turned to local financiers, mostly Greek and Armenian bankers, who specialized in short-term lending at brutal rates. Interest of 18 to 20% was not unusual. These loans were meant to bridge gaps. In reality, they accelerated the fall. The state was borrowing at usurious rates simply to keep functioning from month to month. It was financial suicide disguised as necessity. At the same time, Sultan Abdulaziz remained trapped in a different illusion: military prestige. He looked at the great powers of Europe and saw steel fleets and modern artillery. Instead of fixing the empire's foundations, he attempted to replicate their symbols of power. Warships were ordered from British shipyards, cannons were purchased from Germany. On paper, the Ottoman Navy briefly became one of the largest in the world. But paper strength does not float. There was no money for coal, no money for maintenance, no money to train crews. The ironclads sat idle in the Golden Horn, slowly rusting under the sun, massive, immobile monuments to debt. They were not weapons. They were liabilities anchored in water. Then the world turned against the empire. In 1873, a financial panic erupted in Vienna and spread outward, triggering what became known as the Long Depression. Credit markets seized, European banks, suddenly struggling to survive themselves, stopped lending. The flow of foreign capital that had sustained the Ottoman system abruptly froze. The empire had built its survival on continuous borrowing, and now the pipeline was dry. As if that shock were not enough, nature delivered another blow. In 1873 and 1874, catastrophic drought struck the Anatolian heartland. Crops failed across entire regions. Livestock died in the fields. Famine followed. Villages emptied. Hunger spread faster than relief. When tax collectors arrived, they found no surplus to extract, only dust, abandoned homes, and bodies. The revenue base of the empire collapsed almost overnight, but the debt did not adjust. Interest payments remained fixed, indifferent to drought or depression. Money stopped coming in, payments kept going out. This was the moment when the illusion finally shattered. The empire was no longer balancing on the edge. It had lost its footing entirely, and there was nothing left to borrow against except its own survival. By 1875, there was nothing left to pretend. The treasury was empty, not temporarily strained, not awaiting the next shipment of funds, empty. Ledgers no longer hid the truth. A massive payment to European bondholders was due in October, and there was no cash to meet it. The usual solution, floating another loan, was no longer available. The markets were closed. Confidence had vanished. No banker would extend credit to what everyone now called the sick man. With no path forward, the Ottoman government made a decision that sent shockwaves through Europe. On October 6, 1875, it issued what became known as the Decree of Ramadan. The language was careful, almost polite. Debt payments would be reduced. Half would be paid in cash. The other half would be replaced with paper IOUs, promising a 5% return at some point in the future. In diplomatic terms, it was described as a moratorium. In financial reality, it was a default. The reaction was immediate and furious. Across Britain and France, hundreds of thousands of middle-class investors had poured their savings into Ottoman bonds, drawn by high yields and reassured by the empire's size. Overnight, those investments collapsed. Newspapers erupted with accusations. The Ottomans were labeled thieves, liars, swindlers. Sympathy disappeared. So did political support. The consequences were swift. The empire's financial weakness became an open invitation. In 1877, Russia struck again. This time, there were no allies rushing to defend Istanbul. The Ottoman army fought, but it was unpaid, undersupplied, and exhausted. The result was catastrophic. Russian forces advanced to the outskirts of the capital. The empire was forced into a humiliating peace. Vast territories in the Balkans and the Caucasus were lost. But the most crushing blow was financial. Russia imposed a war indemnity of over 800 million francs, a sum so large it dwarfed anything the Ottomans could realistically repay. At that moment, the truth was undeniable. The empire was insolvent. It had lost its land, its credit, and its leverage. Military defeat had followed financial collapse, not the other way around. And now, with no strength left to resist, the door was open for the final mechanism to move into place, not conquest by armies, but control through administration. Britain and France now faced a choice. They could march armies into Ottoman territory, divide the land, and shoulder the cost of ruling millions of people. Or they could do something far more efficient. They could take control of the empire without ever governing it. They chose the second option. They did not conquer territory. They conquered cash flow. In December 1881, the arrangement was formalized through the Decree of Muharrem. Out of this decree emerged an institution unlike anything that had existed before, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, known as the OPDA. It was not a ministry, it was not an Ottoman agency, it was a foreign-run corporation designed explicitly to extract repayment. This was a conquest without uniforms. No generals arrived in Istanbul. Bankers did. No swords were drawn. Contracts were signed. The OPDA was granted direct control over the empire's most reliable sources of income revenues that no state could function without. Taxes on salt, silk, tobacco, fishing, spirits, and stamp duties were removed from the Sultan's authority and handed to foreign administrators. The empire no longer collected its own lifeblood. To enforce this system, the OPDA built its own apparatus. More than 5,000 armed tax collectors were deployed across Ottoman lands. They did not answer to the Sultan. They did not report to Istanbul. They answered to Europe. From the moment a fisherman sold his catch or a farmer harvested silk, a portion of that value was already spoken for, destined to leave the country. By 1914, this mechanism controlled roughly 1/3 of all Ottoman state revenue. The government still existed, but it operated with what remained. Policy became performance. Authority became symbolic. The state had not been abolished, it had been subordinated. Later, the chain simply changed hands. Germany entered through the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, financed by Deutsche Bank, backed by kilometric guarantees and mineral rights embedded along the tracks. British influence faded. German leverage grew. Debt remained constant. The empire, desperate for escape, gambled on Germany during World War I. It lost. The empire collapsed. But the debt did not. When the Republic of Turkey was founded in 1923, the old obligations returned. Carried in ledgers rather than flags, the new state inherited the mortgage of the dead empire. Payments continued year after year, draining a nation trying to rebuild from ruins. The final installment was paid on May 25, 1954. Exactly 100 years after the first loan was signed. Empires may fall, borders may change, but debt, once accepted, has a longer memory than history itself. The Ottoman Empire didn't collapse because it ran out of soldiers or territory. It collapsed because it ran out of control. Long before the flag came down, ownership had already changed hands. The empire still existed on maps, but its future was being decided elsewhere, one payment at a time. It believed modernity could be bought, that progress could be imported, that borrowing was temporary and independence was permanent. What it learned too late is that money is never neutral. Every loan carries expectations. Every bond carries leverage. Debt doesn't need to conquer you. It only needs time. This is the quiet lesson history leaves behind. You don't have to invade a nation to own it. You don't need armies in the streets or flags over palaces. If you control the revenue, if you control the obligations, you control the choices. Sovereignty doesn't disappear in a moment, it erodes, slowly, until one day it's gone and no one can say exactly when it happened. The Ottomans were foreclosed, not defeated. Their empire outlived its freedom, and generations paid for decisions made under pressure, dressed up as necessity. That is the true cost of dependency, not collapse, but inheritance. History doesn't repeat itself word for word, but it remembers patterns. And once you see them, you start noticing how familiar they feel. Now you know what to listen for, not the sound of war, but the silence that follows a signature.